The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows on the stone walls of the confessional. Father Thomas, a man worn thin by years of listening to the sins of the village, shifted uncomfortably. He expected theft, perhaps a little envy, maybe even a harsh word spoken in anger. He did not expect this. "And you say," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "that this happens often?" From the darkness, a woman's voice, laced with a mixture of shame and defiance, replied, "As often as the harvest moon hangs full in the sky, Father, as often as my husband, Lord Elmsworth, deems it necessary to purify our lineage." Father Thomas swallowed hard. He had known Lord Elmsworth his entire life, a stern, pious man known for his unwavering adherence to the scriptures and his generous donations to the church. He was, in the eyes of the villagers, a pillar of virtue. The idea that he was engaging in unconventional marital practices was almost beyond comprehension. "Tell me everything, daughter," Father Thomas instructed, steeling himself. "Leave nothing out. Only through complete confession can you find true absolution." Lady Esmeralda took a deep breath, the rustle of her silken gown the only sound in the small, suffocating space. "It began shortly after our marriage, Father. Lord Elmsworth, ever concerned with the purity of our bloodline, became obsessed with ensuring the strength and vitality of our future children. He pored over ancient texts, rediscovered in the Elmsworth family library, texts that spoke of rituals and practices long forgotten, deemed heretical by the church, but essential, he believed, to guarantee a line of powerful heirs." She paused, her voice cracking with emotion. The first time he told me that we would be partaking in a fertility rite, I assumed it would be a simple prayer, perhaps a special meal blessed by the village priest. But then he led me down to the ancient crypt beneath the castle, a place I had never dared to venture before. There, surrounded by the tombs of our ancestors, he unveiled the tools. Father Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He gripped the wooden partition separating him from Lady Esmeralda, his knuckles white. He knew the Elmsworth crypt. It was a place of cold stone and forgotten memories, a place where the very air felt heavy with the weight of centuries. To perform such acts within its hallowed halls, it was blasphemy of the highest order. "He presented me with a birch rod, Father, demanding I flog myself while chanting ancient incantations in a language I did not understand. He claimed it would awaken the earth goddess within me, preparing my womb for the seed of a strong and noble lineage. I refused, of course. I told him it was madness, sacrilege. But he insisted. He told me it was my duty, my sacred obligation as a wife to ensure the continuation of the Elmsworth line." Lady Esmeralda's voice trembled. "When I still resisted, he forced me. He held me down and performed the ritual himself, his face contorted with a strange mixture of piety and something else, something dark and disturbing. He whipped me until my skin bled, chanting those infernal words over and over again. And then he forced himself upon me, claiming it was an act of divine union, a necessary sacrifice to appease the ancient gods." Father Thomas felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had heard rumors, whispers of strange practices among the nobility, of secret societies and forbidden rituals, but he had always dismissed them as idle gossip, the product of overactive imaginations. Now, confronted with the horrifying reality, he felt his faith waver. "It didn't stop there, Father," Lady Esmeralda continued, her voice growing stronger, more resolute. "The birch rod was just the beginning. He introduced other practices. He forced me to consume strange concoctions brewed from herbs and roots, concoctions that tasted of earth and decay. He made me bathe in milk mixed with the blood of sacrificed animals, claiming it would imbue me with the strength and vitality of the beasts. He even brought a village idiot, a simple-minded boy named Barnaby, into our bedchamber, claiming that his pure, unadulterated seed would strengthen the Elmsworth bloodline. Father Thomas gasped. This was beyond anything he could have imagined. Adultery was a sin, yes, but this was something far more sinister. It was a desecration of marriage, a perversion of faith, a complete and utter betrayal of God's law. "I have endured this for years, Father," Lady Esmeralda said, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. "I have suffered in silence, praying for deliverance, but I can bear it no longer. I fear for my soul, Father. I fear that I am being dragged down into the depths of depravity, that I am losing my very self. I beg you, Father, tell me what to do. Tell me how to escape this nightmare." Father Thomas closed his eyes, his mind reeling. He was a simple priest, ill-equipped to deal with such a complex and dangerous situation. He knew that exposing Lord Elmsworth would have dire consequences, not just for himself, but for the entire village. The Elmsworth family held immense power and influence, and crossing them could mean ruin for everyone. But he also knew that he could not, in good conscience, stand idly by while Lady Esmeralda was subjected to such horrific abuse. He opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the crucifix hanging on the wall. He knew what he had to do. "Daughter," he said, his voice now firm and resolute, "you have come to the right place. God has led you to me, and I will not fail you. I will help you escape this darkness, even if it means risking my own life." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But first," he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "we need to gather evidence. We need to prove Lord Elmsworth's guilt beyond any shadow of a doubt. And for that," he said, a glint of steel in his eyes, "we may have to delve into the very heart of his depravity." "I will do whatever it takes, Father," Lady Esmeralda replied, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "Whatever it takes to expose his wickedness and reclaim my life." The candlelight flickered once more, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the confessional, as the unlikely alliance between a humble priest and a tormented noblewoman began to take shape. A plan born of desperation, fueled by righteous anger, and destined to plunge them both into the dark and dangerous underbelly of medieval society. The plan, hatched in the hushed confines of the confessional, was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Father Thomas, guided by Lady Esmeralda's detailed descriptions, would infiltrate the Elmsworth crypt and gather evidence of Lord Elmsworth's heretical practices. Lady Esmeralda, meanwhile, would subtly poison her husband's mind against his closest allies, sowing seeds of distrust and paranoia. Their hope was to isolate him, making him vulnerable to exposure. The first step was the crypt. Under the cloak of darkness, Father Thomas, armed with only a flickering lantern and a trembling resolve, navigated the treacherous descent. The air grew colder with each step, the stench of damp earth and decaying stone filling his nostrils. He clutched his rosary, whispering prayers for guidance and protection. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water and the frantic beating of his own heart. He reached the bottom, a vast chamber filled with ancient sarcophagi and crumbling statues. The Elmsworth ancestors, frozen in stone, seemed to watch him with disapproving eyes. He recognized the area Lady Esmeralda had described, a small alcove hidden behind a tapestry depicting a particularly gruesome battle scene. Behind the tapestry, he found it, a makeshift altar constructed from rough-hewn stones, stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Scattered around it were the tools of Lord Elmsworth's perverse rituals. The birch rod, now cracked and worn, a collection of strange, unidentifiable herbs, and a small, intricately carved idol depicting a fertility goddess with exaggerated features. He carefully collected the items, placing them in a sack he had brought with him. He also found a leather-bound book, its pages filled with Lord Elmsworth's meticulous notes on the rituals, written in a bizarre mixture of Latin and archaic English. The book was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, detailing the precise methods and purposes of each practice. As he was about to leave, his lantern flickered, casting its light on something he had previously overlooked. On the far wall, etched into the stone with a crude, almost childlike hand, were a series of symbols. He recognized them immediately. They were ancient pagan runes associated with fertility and witchcraft. But they were also twisted, perverted, distorted in ways that suggested a dark and malevolent influence. He felt a chill run down his spine. He had stumbled upon something far more sinister than mere marital deviancy. Lord Elmsworth was not simply engaging in unorthodox practices. He was dabbling in forbidden arts, flirting with powers beyond his comprehension. He quickly gathered his things and fled the crypt, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was walking on dangerous ground, that he was confronting forces far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. But he also knew that he could not turn back now. Lady Esmeralda's life, and perhaps the fate of the entire village, depended on him. Meanwhile, Lady Esmeralda was putting her own part of the plan into action. She began by subtly undermining Lord Elmsworth's trust in his closest advisors, Sir Reginald and Lord Beaumont. She whispered doubts about their loyalty, hinting at secret alliances and hidden agendas. She played on Lord Elmsworth's vanity and insecurity, suggesting that Sir Reginald was secretly envious of his position and that Lord Beaumont was only feigning respect. She also began to act strangely herself, feigning illness and claiming to have visions. She spoke of omens and prophecies, subtly guiding Lord Elmsworth towards the belief that his enemies were conspiring against him. She knew that his paranoia was his greatest weakness, and she exploited it ruthlessly. Her efforts began to bear fruit. Lord Elmsworth grew increasingly suspicious of his advisors, withdrawing from them and relying more and more on his wife. He became more irritable and unpredictable, prone to fits of rage and sudden changes of mood. He was slowly unraveling, his mind poisoned by suspicion and fear. One evening, after a particularly elaborate and unsettling fertility rite, Lord Elmsworth summoned Lady Esmeralda to his chambers. He was pale and agitated, his eyes bloodshot. "Esmeralda," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I have been having visions, terrible visions. I see enemies all around me, plotting my downfall." Lady Esmeralda feigned concern. "What do you mean, my lord?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They are everywhere," he said, his gaze darting around the room. "Sir Reginald, Lord Beaumont, even Father Thomas. They all want what I have. They want to take my power, my land, my lineage." Lady Esmeralda saw her opportunity. Perhaps you are right, my lord," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Perhaps you need to take action to protect yourself and your family." "What do you suggest?" he asked, his eyes fixed on her. "I suggest you eliminate the threat," she said, her voice as cold as ice, "before it eliminates you." Lord Elmsworth stared at her, his face a mask of fear and uncertainty. But how? I cannot simply kill them. That would be wrong." "You must do what is necessary, my lord," Lady Esmeralda said, her voice unwavering. "For the good of your family, for the good of the Elmsworth line." She paused, taking a deep breath. "And I know just how to do it," she added, a subtle smile playing on her lips. The anatomy of vice was taking shape, a twisted tapestry woven from deception, manipulation, and the darkest desires of the human heart. Father Thomas and Lady Esmeralda were playing a dangerous game, a game that could cost them their lives.
but they were determined to win, to expose the evil that lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly pious and respectable society. The medieval times, after all, were not always as noble as the stories told. And little did they know that the weird sexual practices were just a symptom, a gateway into something far more terrifying than they could possibly imagine. The fertility rites were not just about lineage, they were about summoning something ancient and malevolent.
Lady Esmeralda's plan was as simple as it was ruthless. She would use Lord Elmsworth's paranoia and his obsession with maintaining his lineage against him. She would convince him that his enemies were not merely plotting against him, but actively trying to sabotage his efforts to produce a strong heir. She would then offer him a solution, a twisted ritual designed to eliminate the threat and ensure the success of his endeavors. The ritual, as she described it to Lord Elmsworth, involved a cleansing feast, a gathering of his closest allies and potential enemies, during which a special concoction would be served. This concoction, she claimed, would be blessed by the ancient gods, imbuing those who drank it with strength and vitality. However, she would secretly lace the drink with a potent poison, disguised by the strong herbs and spices. The poison would not kill immediately, but would slowly weaken and incapacitate the victims, leaving them vulnerable to further cleansing. Lord Elmsworth, blinded by fear and ambition, readily agreed to the plan. He saw it as a divine intervention, a chance to rid himself of his enemies and secure his legacy once and for all. He eagerly began preparations for the feast, unaware that he was walking straight into a trap. Meanwhile, Father Thomas, armed with the evidence he had gathered from the crypt, was seeking help from an unlikely source, Sister Agnes, the abbess of a nearby convent. Sister Agnes was a woman of great wisdom and knowledge, rumored to possess a vast library of forbidden texts and a deep understanding of the occult. Father Thomas knew that she was a risk, but he also knew that she was his only hope of understanding the true nature of Lord Elmsworth's practices. He presented her with the leather-bound book and the pagan artifacts, explaining everything that had transpired. Sister Agnes listened intently, her face growing increasingly grim as she examined the evidence. "This is troubling, Father," she said, her voice grave. "Lord Elmsworth is not simply dabbling in heresy. He is actively summoning something dark. These runes, they are not merely symbols of fertility. They are gateways, conduits to a power that should never be disturbed." She paused, taking a deep breath. "The fertility rites, they are not about ensuring a strong lineage. They are about providing a vessel, a conduit for this power to manifest in the mortal realm. He is trying to birth something terrible." Father Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He had suspected that Lord Elmsworth's practices were more than just perverse, but he had not realized the true extent of the danger. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice filled with desperation. "We must stop him," Sister Agnes said, her voice resolute. "We must prevent him from completing the ritual. But to do so, we need to understand his intentions. We need to know what he is trying to summon." She led Father Thomas to her private study, a dimly lit room filled with ancient books and strange artifacts. She spent hours poring over the leather-bound book, deciphering the cryptic notes and unraveling the complex web of rituals and incantations. Finally, she looked up, her face pale and drawn. "I know what he is trying to do," she said, her voice trembling. "He is trying to summon a daemon, an ancient entity associated with fertility, lust, and death. An entity that feeds on the life force of its hosts, twisting and corrupting them from within." "A daemon?" Father Thomas repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Sister Agnes said, "and the fertility rites, they are not just about preparing Lady Esmeralda's womb.
They are about preparing her body and soul to become the vessel for this daemon. He intends to impregnate her with something unholy. Father Thomas felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The horror of the situation was almost too much to bear. He had to stop Lord Elmsworth, not just for Lady Esmeralda's sake, but for the sake of the entire world. The day of the feast arrived, casting a pall over the Elmsworth castle. The great hall was decorated with tapestries and banners, the tables laden with food and drink. Guests arrived from far and wide, dressed in their finest clothes, eager to partake in the festivities. Lord Elmsworth, pale and agitated, greeted his guests with forced smiles and nervous laughter. He seemed to be on edge, constantly scanning the room, suspicious of everyone around him. Lady Esmeralda, dressed in a stunning gown of black velvet, moved through the crowd with a serene smile, her eyes betraying none of the turmoil within. She greeted her husband's guests with grace and charm, subtly poisoning their minds with whispered doubts and veiled threats. As the feast progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The guests, sensing the undercurrent of suspicion and fear, became guarded and wary, exchanging furtive glances and hushed whispers. Finally, Lord Elmsworth rose to his feet, his voice trembling slightly. "My friends," he said, "I have called you here today to celebrate the strength and vitality of the Elmsworth line. I have long sought to ensure the continuation of our legacy, to produce an heir worthy of our noble name." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And I believe," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "that I have finally found the key to achieving this goal. A secret, ancient ritual blessed by the gods that will imbue us all with strength and fertility." He gestured to a servant who entered the hall carrying a large silver flagon filled with a dark, steaming liquid. "This," Lord Elmsworth announced, "is the elixir of life. Drink deeply, my friends, and let us together forge a new era of prosperity and power for the Elmsworth line." He took the flagon and poured a generous amount of the liquid into a goblet, raising it high in the air. "To the Elmsworth line," he cried, taking a long draught. The guests, hesitant but curious, followed suit, each taking a sip of the mysterious elixir. The liquid was bitter and pungent, with a strange earthy aftertaste. Some grimaced, while others forced smiles, eager to please their host. Lady Esmeralda watched as her husband's guests drank the poisoned elixir, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she was playing with fire, that she was risking everything. But she also knew that she had no choice. She had to stop Lord Elmsworth, no matter the cost. As the guests continued to eat and drink, Lady Esmeralda slipped away, unnoticed, heading towards the ancient crypt beneath the castle. She knew that Father Thomas and Sister Agnes would be waiting for her there, ready to confront Lord Elmsworth and put an end to his madness. The Feast of Shadows had begun, a night of deception, betrayal, and unspeakable horror. The fate of the Elmsworth line, and perhaps the fate of the world, hung in the balance.
The crypt was even colder and more oppressive than Father Thomas remembered. The air hung thick with the stench of decay, and the silence was broken only by the frantic fluttering of bats disturbed by their arrival. Sister Agnes, her face pale but resolute, clutched a silver crucifix in her hand, her lips moving in silent prayer. Lady Esmeralda arrived, breathless and shaken, relaying the events of the feast. She described the growing unease among the guests, the strange taste of the elixir, and the increasingly erratic behavior of Lord Elmsworth. "He is close to completing the ritual," she said, her voice trembling. "I can feel it. The air is charged with something dark and malevolent." Sister Agnes nodded grimly. "We must act now," she said, "before it is too late." She led them to the altar, the site of Lord Elmsworth's perverse rituals. She examined the runes etched into the wall, her brow furrowed in concentration.
"These runes," she said, "they are the key. They are the conduits through which the daemon is being summoned. We must disrupt them, break the connection." She produced a small vial of holy water and sprinkled it on the runes, chanting ancient Latin prayers. The runes flickered and hissed, as if resisting the holy water's purifying touch. "It's working," Father Thomas said, his voice filled with hope. "The connection is weakening." Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the crypt. It was Lord Elmsworth's voice, filled with terror and agony. "He's begun the final incantation," Lady Esmeralda gasped. "We have to stop him." They raced back towards the great hall, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they approached, they could hear a cacophony of sounds, screams, shouts, and a strange guttural chanting. They burst into the hall to find a scene of unimaginable horror. The guests were writhing on the floor, their bodies contorted in unnatural positions. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes filled with terror. Some were screaming, while others were choking and gasping for air. Lord Elmsworth stood at the head of the table, his eyes glazed over, his body shaking uncontrollably. He was chanting in a strange, guttural language, his voice rising to a fever pitch. A dark, swirling vortex of energy had formed above him, crackling with unholy power. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and decay. "He's summoning the daemon," Sister Agnes cried. "We must stop him now." She charged towards Lord Elmsworth, brandishing her crucifix. "In the name of God, I command you to cease this blasphemy," she shouted. Lord Elmsworth, seemingly oblivious to her presence, continued chanting, his voice growing louder and more frantic. Sister Agnes reached him and thrust the crucifix towards his face. Lord Elmsworth recoiled, his skin blistering and smoking where the crucifix touched him. He screamed in agony, his chanting faltering. The vortex of energy above him flickered and wavered, threatening to collapse. But it held, sustained by Lord Elmsworth's unwavering devotion. Father Thomas and Lady Esmeralda rushed to Sister Agnes's side, trying to pull Lord Elmsworth away from the altar. But he was too strong, his body fueled by the dark energy of the daemon. He grabbed Sister Agnes by the throat, his eyes burning with unholy fire. "You cannot stop me," he shrieked. "I will bring forth the power of the ancient gods. I will create a new world ruled by strength and lust." He squeezed her throat, cutting off her air supply. Sister Agnes gasped and struggled, her face turning blue. Father Thomas, overcome with rage and desperation, grabbed a nearby candlestick and smashed it over Lord Elmsworth's head. Lord Elmsworth staggered, releasing Sister Agnes. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Lord Elmsworth turned his attention to Father Thomas, his face contorted with rage. "You will pay for that, priest," he roared. "You will all pay." He lunged at Father Thomas, his hands outstretched, his fingers like claws. Father Thomas stumbled backwards, trying to evade his grasp. But Lord Elmsworth was too fast, too strong. He grabbed Father Thomas by the throat, lifting him off the ground. Father Thomas gasped for air, his vision blurring. "I will kill you," Lord Elmsworth hissed, his face inches from Father Thomas's. "I will send you to hell to burn for eternity." Suddenly, Lady Esmeralda stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. She held a dagger in her hand, its blade gleaming in the flickering candlelight. "I'm sorry, my lord," she said, her voice trembling, "but I cannot let you do this." She plunged the dagger into Lord Elmsworth's back. Lord Elmsworth screamed, his body convulsing. He released Father Thomas, who slumped to the floor, gasping for air. Lord Elmsworth turned to face Lady Esmeralda, his eyes filled with betrayal and rage. You traitor," he croaked. "I gave you everything. I made you a queen." "You made me a prisoner," Lady Esmeralda replied, her voice filled with sorrow. "You turned me into something I never wanted to be." She plunged the dagger into his chest, driving it deep into his heart. Lord Elmsworth's body went limp. He slumped to the floor, dead. The vortex of energy above him collapsed, dissipating into nothingness. The air grew still, the stench of sulfur fading away. The guests on the floor stopped writhing, their bodies slowly returning to normal. They looked around, confused and disoriented, unsure of what had just transpired. Sister Agnes, recovering from her near strangulation, rose to her feet, her face pale but determined. "It is done," she said, her voice trembling. "The daemon has been banished. The ritual has been stopped." But the victory was bittersweet. Lord Elmsworth was dead, and Lady Esmeralda was a murderess. The Feast of Shadows had claimed its victims, leaving a trail of destruction and despair in its wake. The question remained, however, had they truly stopped the entity, or merely delayed its arrival? And what would be the price of their victory? The daemon's embrace, even rejected, leaves a mark. Chapter 5. The Scars of Absolution. The aftermath of the feast was a whirlwind of chaos and recrimination. The surviving guests, initially confused and disoriented, slowly began to piece together the events of the night, their horror and outrage growing with each revelation. Lady Esmeralda, despite her act of saving them all, was immediately imprisoned. The villagers, swayed by a mixture of fear and ingrained societal norms, could not overlook the fact that she had murdered her husband, regardless of the circumstances. Father Thomas and Sister Agnes, though instrumental in uncovering Lord Elmsworth's depravity, were also viewed with suspicion, their association with such dark practices casting a shadow over their reputations. A trial was convened, presided over by a stern and unyielding judge. The evidence against Lady Esmeralda was overwhelming. Witnesses testified to her act of murder, the poisoned elixir, and Lord Elmsworth's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the feast. The defense, led by Father Thomas, was a desperate plea for understanding. He recounted Lady Esmeralda's years of suffering, her forced participation in the bizarre rituals, and her ultimate act of self-sacrifice. Sister Agnes, summoned as an expert witness, spoke of the demonic forces at play, explaining the true nature of Lord Elmsworth's practices and the existential threat he posed to the entire community. She presented the artifacts from the crypt, the leather-bound book, and her own interpretation of the runes, painting a terrifying picture of a world teetering on the brink of darkness. Despite their impassioned pleas, the judge remained unmoved. He acknowledged the extenuating circumstances, but ultimately ruled that Lady Esmeralda was guilty of murder. Her sentence, life imprisonment, within the walls of the very convent where Sister Agnes resided. Father Thomas, devastated by the verdict, pleaded with the judge for leniency, but to no avail. He visited Lady Esmeralda in her prison cell, offering her solace and absolution. "You did what you had to do, Esmeralda," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "You saved us all from a terrible fate. God will forgive you." Lady Esmeralda, though physically exhausted and emotionally drained, seemed strangely at peace. "I don't seek forgiveness, Father," she said. "I only seek understanding. I did what I believed was right, and I am prepared to accept the consequences." She spent her remaining years within the convent walls, finding solace in prayer and contemplation. She assisted Sister Agnes in her studies, delving deeper into the mysteries of the occult, seeking to understand the forces that had so profoundly impacted her life. Father Thomas, forever haunted by the events of the feast, dedicated his life to serving the poor and the afflicted. He used his newfound knowledge of the dark arts to protect his parishioners from similar threats, becoming a vigilant guardian against the forces of evil. The village, though scarred by the events, slowly began to heal. The memory of Lord Elmsworth's depravity served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of resisting temptation. As for the weird sexual practices that had started it all, they became a whispered legend, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones around the fire. Some dismissed them as mere fantasies, the product of overactive imaginations. Others believed that they were a symptom of a deeper malaise, a manifestation of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of medieval society.